Good evening and welcome to Connect to Escape. My name's Kara Sterling and tonight we're going to be discussing loneliness. Loneliness is something that has affected each and every one of us in some way, shape and form. But how do we deal with it and how do we go about filling the gaps? Stay tuned to find out more on Connect to Escape. Joining me this evening, we have Patrick Johnson, who is currently a doctoral student at King's College. We have Andrew Leyland, who is the Director of English at Newbold College. Sophia Peart, who is a theological student. And John Olare, who is a recruitment professional at Newbold College also. Tonight we're discussing loneliness, and we went out to members of the public and we asked them, what makes you happy when you're lonely? Let's see what they said.
What makes you feel better when you're lonely?
Music.
Singing, I would say.
I don't get lonely.
Oh, that's good.
I'm always with people, with family, so...
Glass of wine.
A glass of wine.
Being with my partner.
What makes me feel better when I'm lonely? Watching the telly.
Music.
Desserts. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
I love watching Friends. I love watching Two and a Half Men.
Speaking with your friends or my pets.
Where's all the new comedies?
What makes you happy when you are lonely?
I think me.
Speaking to my family.
That's the only thing that can make me happy, right? I can make myself happy if I'm lonely.
Thinking of nice things, I suppose. Thinking of past happiness.
Oh, okay, well thank you so much for that. Have a lovely day.
It was interesting, the variety of answers that they were giving. There was everything from, family and chocolate and sweet things. Sophia, the Office for National Statistics found Britain to be one of the loneliest countries in the EU. Why do you think this is?
I think one of the reasons for the UK may be the breakdown of the extended family because of work, issues such as immigration, people travelling for work in other places of the country. It breaks down the extended family and can actually isolate people. I think that might be one of the reasons.
I think part of the culture as well is to be somewhat insular, possibly. We tend to be that way in the UK, and if your immediate family aren't around, then that does kind of breed more loneliness, I would think, especially if you're not getting to know your neighbours a lot and all the rest of it. So I think that contributes as well to the UK being somewhat of a lonely place for many people.
I mean, I think in London, something that I've found is everyone is so much on the go. It's their head is forward. They don't look and try to connect with anybody around them. It's I'm going to where I'm going, and that's the main important thing. And I think that there's a sense of loss in the sense of building relationships or connecting with people around. And it's I don't know. It's hard to build new relationships if you're not paying attention to the people around you and if you're only focused on yourself. And in a time when everyone is trying to become successful, make money, establish themselves, it's almost like there's not enough time to discover new relationships or.
Being in America, I just wanted to ask you, being in America, you seem to be much more open and easy to talk with people. Would you say loneliness is less of a problem in the States than it would be in England?
I would actually say it's a different type of loneliness. I think something that I've found growing up all over the United States is that while you may connect with a lot of people, there's not a lot of genuine relationships that you build. There's a lot of surface friendships and a lot of, hey, how are you doing? Good morning, hello. And, you do get that interaction, but in terms of, diving deeper into relationships or friendships or whatnot, it's very rare that you find someone who can, in my experience, connect with all the people that they interact with. So it's kind of like finding a balance between being open to new relationships and friendships, but then also allocating enough time to put genuine interest or put enough focus to actually grow, those relationships. I don't think that America is less lonely, but I do think we're a bit more friendly. I don't know.
I think with English people as well, we're very private people, aren't we? We tend to keep things to ourselves or within a very small circle of people. And I think when certainly working in the college I work in with 30, 40 different nationalities there, if someone is lonely from other countries, they make an effort to get out, meet people and address their loneliness. Whereas British people were a little bit more, we tend to, we not naturally go out there and make friends so easily perhaps. We are very personal, and I think that sort of compounds with loneliness and can cause it to be a little more of a problem. But I'm quite surprised at that statistic. It's quite surprising.
I can totally resonate. I mean, I remember 30 years ago, it wouldn't be a problem to knock on your neighbour's door and ask for a teaspoon of sugar or something like that. And as time has gone along in the UK, it's much harder to do that. It may be because we've become a lot more multicultural, so we're not sure whether that knock on the door will be greeted or not. I know in the north, there was such a community, a sense of community, and that over time has broken down. And I think that's one of the contributing factors as well to loneliness, because people want a sense of belonging. People want to know that they're part of something. And when they don't feel that they are, or when that's broken down in a community, it creates the isolation and then the loneliness.
Yeah, I noticed that very much when I left England in 1990 and went over to Norway. When I left, at least, children would play on the streets and things like that. Coming back 14 years later, and there's like none of that whatsoever. You have to make an appointment if you want to go and see your neighbour, etc. There's been definitely a shift to be even more insular, I feel. There are all kinds of reasons for that, I guess.
I think also the busyness of life. I think, John, you touched on that. We've become so busy that we don't have those times to just have those moments to pop in and see, your neighbour, see how she's getting on, because time doesn't afford. You've got things to do,
I think as well, social media has had an impact into how we interact with each other. As they say, people who are close have gone further away, and those who are further away have come closer with social media. And I think we've lost our skills in how we connect with people.
So I think what we're finding, although we're talking a lot about the UK, I think it's really universal, the different issues that we face as to why we feel lonely. We're going to get back to this, but for now, let's just enjoy some music.
The thought into my Father's arms. I'm finally all the winds of change, they blow slow and cool. All the wanderings of a fool, but I have laid me down in my Father's arms, where the winds of suffering are carried by the arms of the cross, healing my loss, where I can walk, where I can run, where my heart sings and I feel the sun, where I can trust and I'm strong enough, free like the wind I'll run into my Father's arms. Heaven has reached into my lonely soul, loving so deep and so complete, so till I don't feel alone, where the light of love is burning, where the past is washed away, where I feel the sunlight shining on my face. Now I can walk, now I can run, now my heart sings and I feel the sun. Now I can trust and I'm strong enough, free like the wind I run into my Father's arms. I'm finally
Doesn't she have the most wonderful voice? Just breathtaking. But back to our discussion for today. We've been talking about loneliness, and I'd like to ask you, Andrew, if you could just share an experience of yours where you've experienced loneliness.
Yeah, I'm not a person who gets lonely too often. Fortunate I enjoy my own company, and I do enjoy being alone at times. But like everybody, there are times when I get lonely. I, like Patrick, moved overseas a few years ago to South Korea, where I was teaching English. And for the first few months I was there, it gets quite lonely. I know, Patrick, you've been to that part of the world as well. And you do miss home, you miss being around people who are familiar to you, who think the same, speak the same. And yeah, I felt lonely, and you'd kind of try and find places where people similar to you would hang out and spend time. But a few years after I left Korea, I came back to England with my wife, who's from South Korea, and she came to live in England. And Korean people really enjoy being together. Family, friendships, everything they do, they like to share and experience together. And she came to England and found it really hard to adjust when she came here. She arrived with no friends, her family back in Korea, and we lived in a small suburb, a very small area, which was very peaceful and very gentle. And she come from a city with over 20 million people, and her biggest her thing for her loneliness was that she missed being around people. not necessarily people who she knew, but just being around people. I can remember one evening she called me. I was at work and she was feeling really homesick, really lonely. She talked about this separation from family, separation from friends. It was cutting really deep. She really was lonely. And I told her, I said, go for a walk. Take a walk, clear your head, get some fresh air. You might feel a little bit better. So she went out for a walk, and I called her a little later to ask her, how was it? How was your walk? Do you feel any better? She said, no, I feel worse. I said, why? What happened? She says, I only saw 3 people as I was walking. And she was craving or wanting to be with people. And I think that taught me a lot about loneliness. Often it is that we're human beings. We're designed to be in community. We're designed to be with people. And when we're not, and we are separated from that, we can experience really, real profound loneliness. And the problem with loneliness, I think, as well, is that as it gets worse and worse, we then reject people and almost contribute to it unknowingly as well. So for my wife, she's okay now. She's enjoying her life in England, but she does miss people. She's lonely for family, lonely for friends, and she's a person who likes to be in community. And I think that's pretty much how we as human beings are designed to be people within community. I think that's connected to the God who created us, a God who also is a God who lives in community himself. And when we're separated from that, it can become a really difficult time.
Thank you for sharing your experience and your story with us, Andrew. So leading on for that, we're going to get right back into discussion. The question I have for you is, we live in a society where everyone wants more. So is loneliness a result of our increasing levels of dissatisfaction? John, what do you think about this?
I think that's a very interesting take on the concept of loneliness, a desire to want more, desire to have more. So I can definitely see how it can play into it because, I know for myself that in a desire to grow and in a desire to advance, whether it's in my career or with just in the part of life where I'm at, I want to say almost alienated myself from those around me because I'm so tunnel visioned. I'm not. I only see what's ahead of me. I have my blinders on, and I'm pushing, and people are trying to connect with me. There's opportunities to connect with others, but I'm not looking at them because I have one goal. And I think if you don't intentionally build relationships, if you don't make it a conscious effort to connect, it's very easy to isolate yourself and go in one direction and miss out on the relationships and connecting points that you can have on the way there.
Maybe that is one of the challenges for modern day society, being so very goal focused, that we miss a lot of those opportunities to make good, lasting, deep relationships along the way, because whatever those goals may be, whether it's just your career or getting more money or whatever it is, if that becomes all-encompassing, we lose time to build relationships, and then you end up a number of years down the line and you think, okay, maybe I've reached that goal, but I have no people around me, and then you're really quite stuck, aren't you? Some of the statistics I've seen say that people are getting married later, having children later, and so it seems that this is going to be an increasing problem if you look at it. Being so goal focus that we don't have time for relationships now, as it were. And that could be a bit worrying when you think about it.
I guess along with that is that stress is also an increasing. In fact, stress and depression is increasing, and those are also linked to our strive to be more. I strive to achieve more. Then isolating ourselves, making us lonely, that can stress us and bring us into depression as well. And I think probably a solution to that is being intentional with the relationships that we have around us, being intentional to maintain those relationships as we are continuing to meet our goals in life. Our intention should be, one of our goals should be to intentionally maintain relationships.
I think as well, for my experiences, we tend to have more nowadays friends for different seasons almost, and different periods and different parts of our life, more so than ever. And often friendships sort of don't last as long as perhaps they did in previous times. We have friendships that last a certain length of time, and then our lives move on, and the friendship is left behind. And yeah, you're right. We're so busy doing what we need to do, and we almost feel that we don't need to be in friendships or be in relationships. I don't need friends. I just need my job, my salary. I've got my wife, my children. That's all I need. But it doesn't matter how happy you are in your work or with your family. I still think we need our friendships.
Yeah, and I'm very big on family, and I think that my parents made it a point that family was important, family was key, and I can see in my childhood where I would do everything within my power to get the family together for everything. You know, I wanted to share it, you know, all these different things, different situations, different achievements, hardships with my family. And I think as we transitioned from the West African culture where I, you know, grew up, to a more Western, as I want to say, almost goal. Not to say that the West Africans don't have goals, but, you know, family is such a huge part of the culture where, you know, even the naming of the child in the family, everybody is involved. All the extended family gives a child a name. So therefore, it's not just your immediate family. Your immediate family is your extended family, whether you like it or not. And I think that as I've moved away and I've grown older, it's become harder and harder to be intentional about bringing the family together or involving, you know, that you and I had a conversation before where, you know, conversations with our parents, for me, it's almost, I don't want to say it's a strain, but it's not natural. It's not a, let me call mom up or my dad up to see what's going on. And I think that's a loss for me, honestly.
We've been discussing loneliness this evening, and we have Patrick Johnson with us, who has spent some time preparing his thoughts on this topic, and he's going to share them with us now.
I read an article in The Guardian a few months ago, and the title really caught my attention. It said, "Loneliness, a silent plague that is hurting young people most." And it said that for young Britons, loneliness is an epidemic, and they are even more likely to fall victim to its insidious dangers than the elderly. And that really surprised me. As Keris mentioned earlier, the Office for National Statistics found that Britain is the loneliness capital of Europe. We're less likely to have strong friendships or to know our neighbours than residents anywhere else in the EU. And a relatively high proportion of us have no one to rely on in a crisis. Now, research done by Professor John Cacioppo at the University of Chicago found that loneliness was twice as bad for older people's health as obesity and almost as great a cause of death as poverty. So what we know is that loneliness is definitely a known problem for the elderly, And often we hear that addressed in many different ways. But what surprised me was that it's growing for the 18 to 34-year-olds. The problem with loneliness is that it's got such close connections to mental health. And it's linked to increased stress, as was mentioned earlier, depression, paranoia, anxiety, addiction, and cognitive decline. And it's a known factor in suicide. So that's why we have to take loneliness seriously. What do we do in order to get out of loneliness? Then all kinds of suggestions have been made. One article I read by Laura Ferguson in the Times, she suggested, well, you should take up a new activity, talk to someone about how you're feeling, volunteer, reach out to those around you, even if they're not lonely. Some suggest that social media can help staying in touch with relatives, etc., even though they've moved away. The use of helplines can be useful. It's found that 1 in 4 men who call the Samaritans mention loneliness or isolation as part of the problem. So it's quite a lot of people. Seek counselling, treat your networks as a resource. I guess most of the problems with the suggestions we often come up with is the fact that the lonely person has to be very proactive. And often if you're in a real, if you want to call it depressive cycle of loneliness, then it's very difficult for you to take the initiative. But in reflecting on this, I thought of 3 things that are important, I think. The first thing is that we have to address this phrase that we have in English, no man is an island. And I think that's so very true. We have to acknowledge that we are created as 3-dimensional in our relationships. So we're created to relate to one another, first and foremost. And, in that ancient book, the Bible, it talks about humans being created for friendship and companionship. It actually, those first couple of chapters in the Bible describe creation and everything that went on there with God. And the pattern is very striking. Every time God creates something, he says, this is very good, very good, very good. And then, in the midst of all of this perfection, he says, this isn't good. And the one thing he says that isn't good, because he's created the first man, is that man is on his own. And he says it's not good for man to be alone. So to really impress on us, I guess, the fact that we are created to have relationship with one another. We're not just isolated beings. And we see it all the time, children, those of us who have children, they always want sleepovers. Why is this? They're social beings, so they want to have their friends over. Teens want to be in groups with other teens. Happens, of course. Adults like going out together as friends and mates and doing things. Grandparents love to have the grandchildren over and family over. So we are very social beings, and we need to really acknowledge that. I guess the problem there is that, well, our family and friends can move away, or as will happen with us all, everyone dies. And even then, our family and friends can't always know what's going on deep within us. And even the best of friends can disappoint us sometimes. And this is why I say we're 3-dimensional. This is how the Bible kind of describes us. So we have this relationship with one another, but there's also a kind of vertical relationship too. We're created to relate to a divine being, to God. And if you have that dimension in your thinking, then according to the Bible, you will know that you are never alone. In the part of the Bible where there are lots of songs, the hymn book part of the Bible called Psalms, David becomes very lyrical one time, and he says, now where could I go where you are not, God? If I go as far east as I can, you're there. If I go as far west as I can, you're there. If I go up as far as I can, you're even there or even down. So, in other words, just expressing the idea, when you have a belief in a divine being, you're never alone, which I think can help somewhat in the whole idea. So, first of all, I think we need to just understand no man is an island, no woman is an island. We're never created just to be on our own. We're created to relate to one another, but we're three-dimensional, to relate upwards as well. I think a second thing we need to look at when it comes to loneliness is we need a new kind of way to define ourselves. One of the things I've been looking at is people with disabilities, and if there's one thing that they often complain about is actually it's loneliness. And you might think that's somewhat surprising. People with severe disabilities in particular that are surrounded by carers all the time, coming and going, still feeling lonely. And that's because they often say, I have no real friends. People who miss me when I'm not there. And that's quite a profound thing. And you see, the thing is, we often define ourselves and our relationships and our friendships by what we are able to do, by our abilities, by our interests. In other words, intrinsic things that you can find in me. So if I like football and you like football, we can be friends. And that's how we often define ourselves. And yet, that's how we often are separated from one another. Because if we don't have the same interests, suddenly you're not a friend. We can't relate. If you come from a different country than I do, that makes a separation. And so if we only define ourselves by intrinsic things, it can increase the loneliness that we could feel. And that's where I think the Christian message is really very quite profound, because it gives us a way of defining ourselves that's extrinsic to us. In other words, that we are created to belong to God. And our significance comes in knowing Him. And there's this fantastic symbol of belonging to Jesus. It's called baptism. In other words, you're completely enclosed in Him, and it's quite a powerful symbol. And so, when you become a Christian, all those markers that would normally define you aren't the most significant thing. You are significant because you are in Christ, if you like. And that then means that we don't have to define ourselves by our race, by our national origin, by our gender. It means that we can define ourselves because I am created in God's image. And that means then that we belong to one another. And so one of the big things in church is that we can call each other brother and sister. No matter where you come from, whatever language, we're still brother and sister. So we're immediately related, which I think is a fantastic thing within church, that you don't have to be defined by the normal parameters that people bring to you. I read this great story by a woman named Josie Firstbrook. She describes how she and her husband, they'd adopted a son from Korea. His name was Eric. And when he was 5, they were having lunch at a restaurant. And Eric was making conversation with a boy at the next table. And at one point, this boy said to Eric, "Why is it that you don't look like your mom?" And Eric answered, "Because she's a girl, obviously." and it's like, yeah, of course, yeah. You don't have to accept those parameters that somebody else makes for you, you know. But finally, I think the third thing when it comes to loneliness is to accept support, how vital support is. It's been found by doctors that loneliness, depression, and isolation increase the mortality rate by between 3 and 10 times. So people die much quicker when they're alone. And that's why we need communities of care and support. And that's why I guess churches are so important, if you ask me, because they are immediate communities of care and support. For example, David Spiegel at Stanford University found that support groups doubled the survival rate of women with breast cancer, just being in a support group. Dr. Dean Ornish found that one veteran commits suicide every hour. This is in the States. One active duty soldier commits suicide every day. In other words, more soldiers have been killed by themselves than in active combat in the last few years. So important, this thing with being together. And so Dr. Ornish has concluded that when you have someone you can trust, a good friend, that produces intimacy, which also affects greatly our healing and the meaning that we get in life. So loneliness is really a really significant subject to keep talking about. And that we just need to acknowledge that we're created for relationship, three-way relationships, that we need to change the way in which we define ourselves possibly, but also to actively seek out networks of support.
Thank you, Patrick. So we're just going to jump right in there. Can loneliness be a positive thing in that it forces us to reach out to others? Andrew, do you think?
I'm going to say it can be made into a positive. I wouldn't say it is a positive thing, loneliness. You know, the Bible talks a lot about in weakness we can be made strong. The Bible also talks about, it refers mostly to people who have lost somebody, someone who's passed and you're mourning the death of that person. And the Bible talks about because you've mourned that person and you've experienced that, you can then be a comforter to other people. And I think that can extend to loneliness as well, in that if we've experienced loneliness, we then can empathise and help other people. So I wouldn't say, yes, being lonely is positive, but the experience can help us grow as people. It can help us then to be more sensitive and look out to others, and to look out for them. And I notice it at Newbold. Our church is an international church, an international school. And if I see someone who's just arrived and I can see certain behaviour from them, and I see, I see where I was when I was in Korea 15 years ago. That's what I was doing. I'm then able to use it as a positive when I was lonely to help that person. So I guess, yeah, maybe it can be.
I think I agree there. I remember, a few years ago living on my own, and sometimes, particularly when I'd take an annual leave and say I want a whole week for myself and to look after myself, and maybe a day or two into that whole week, you really think, I feel quite lonely now. And that actually pushes me to actually just go out. And I think you'd mentioned that in one of your in your checklist of things that you can do. Go out and help somebody. Go and impact and influence somebody else's life. However, loneliness, as we know, can have its negative effects, and those negative effects can really affect people and bring them into a depression.
I think it's important that we perhaps differentiate between being alone for a little while and loneliness, because I think loneliness is more of a long-term kind of an experience. So yes, you can be alone for a little while, and that's okay because it gives you time to reflect, etc. I think everybody needs that kind of thing, but loneliness is more of a long-term, weeks and months, and nobody's checking in on you, and you just feel completely cut off. That's much more insidious, and that I think is much more of a negative thing. If I was to be really particular on that. Speaking
on that, I recently moved from the United States to England to work, and I'm living on my own in London, big city. And a couple of months ago, I was talking to my fiance, and I was just telling her how lonely I was. It wasn't the being on my own reflection. It was I miss being around people, and I think that in that I discovered that a positive thing that came from that was I realized that, yes, I missed people, but there were people in my life who were also missing people that I had not been reaching out to. You know, I hadn't been, giving them a call to see how they're doing. The same way I wished people were doing that to me, I wasn't doing that myself. And so she had mentioned, she said, well, why don't you, call your mom, or you can call me more. And I just realized that, wow, okay, I can take ownership of my loneliness and take the control back and use that time to connect. And I've started making more of an effort, to call my mother, because she never is tired of, hearing from me. And I've found that making that conscious effort to reach out not only strengthens other people because they no longer feel lonely, or maybe they were going through that time of where they felt by themselves, but it also allows me to start reconnecting, and it kind of solves that issue for me for a short while. But it's a matter of consistency and making an effort to connect, each time.
It is about being people, I think, as well, because with my wife being lonely in England in a small town, I got lonely in Seoul with 20 million people, and sometimes the more people you're with, the lonelier you can become. And I think it's just having somebody who will listen to you. That's what, for me, defines when you miss a person, just someone you can just talk to. They don't have to talk back to you, they don't have to offer you a solution to your problem, just someone who's able to listen.
So Patrick, if you had to really summarize this topic of loneliness and how we deal with it and how we can fill the gaps within our lives, how would you do that?
I would say maybe we just got to take active control of our own fate, if you want. Acknowledge that we're three-dimensional beings in our relationships. So build across to other people, but also acknowledge that there is a God, because you're never alone when you know that you have a God on your side. Think of a different way of defining yourself. Cross all those boundaries that you've naturally set up and think of defining yourself in another way. I would recommend a church is a great place to do that, because you meet people of all kinds of backgrounds and interests and nationalities, and use that kind of support network to help you out of your loneliness.
I hope that this evening you've been able to learn a little more about loneliness and how we can combat it and tackle it and overcome it within our lives. I'd like to thank each and every one of you for joining us this evening and for sharing your thoughts and opinions. And also thank you back home for tuning in and for being part of it also. Please join us tomorrow. We're going to be back at the same time, and we're going to be discussing how you can make the most of the rest of your life. See you then. Take care.